In the middle. How are we doing? We good? Yeah, good. Thank you very much for coming out this evening. I know it's pretty miserable out there, so really do appreciate you coming along to the start of the 2022 Football Writing Festival. As has already been said, I'm Ben from BBC Sport. I'm going to be your host for the evening. The less you hear from me, the better, because I have two of the most erudite brains in football who are going to be waxing lyrical about a really interesting topic. Yeah, we're talking about expected goals, XG. So it's a panel for those of you that like clean sheets as much as you like spreadsheets, or anybody that wants to know a little bit more about the numbers behind football. And as any fan will tell you, it's not just about winning, it's about how you win. Or indeed, if you're a Spurs or Man United fan today, how you lose. As Rory is very happy, as the Liverpool fan in the room. So we're going to get in. I will firstly introduce to you the New York Times Chief Soccer Correspondent, Rory Smith, and Stockport County's Director of Football, Simon Wilson. Welcome along. Big round of applause. So Rory and Simon, first of all, just kind of kick us off on what we're basically here to talk about today and the research in the area of interest for you.
Well, I guess data and analytics are probably one of the most cutting-edge elements of modern football. I think it's changed football in a lot of ways that people, some of which you see, some of which you don't. Sometimes it gets given more credit than it deserves. Sometimes it gets more blame than it deserves. And that was kind of what made me want to write the book, was I think a lot has changed in football in the last 21 years, probably since Simon got involved. That was the revolutionary point. And I think a lot of that has happened behind the scenes, and there are times when that has kind of burst into the public domain. So when Match of the Day started putting the XG on the little yellow ticker after games, and everyone thought, Arsene Wenger quoted it. People sort of thought, what is this kind of witchcraft? But there's a lot of work that has been going on for a long time to bring us to that point, and it's kind of representative of a broader change that we maybe need to understand more to fully understand what we're seeing played out on our screens.
And so you were one of the pioneers of this. Tell our audience here a little bit about your background to this and the role that you've played in the explosion over the last 2 decades.
Yeah, well, being one of the pioneers in data analysis, I don't know how many dreams are made about that, but I wouldn't say I was in any way or shape or form, really, but I was kind of at the right place at the right time. And I suppose my journey goes back to as a kid playing. I probably had more interest in coaching than playing, and as a not as a real accident, but in the end came out of playing and went into sort of more coaching and studying the game. And this was sort of 96, 97 type time. And, there was there was no data analysts at clubs. There was very few computers probably in football at all at the time. And so it was a very new field. And but it just so happened, I suppose around that time, like with, things outside of football, just in wider life, technology started to accelerate. It was around that kind of .com kind of area, and that type of stuff just coming into everything, into offices around, for everyone's normal jobs and things like that, but also coming into sport and coming into football, and just managed, it sort of accelerated over the next period, and I was just starting my career at that time, and just getting into coaching and getting into professional football clubs at that time. So yeah, like I said, right place, right time, but probably a lot harder to cut through at that time than where we sit today, sort of 20 years on, and as you say, with it being so common and widely known about.
Yeah. That period in the 90s, I think, is really important. Hang on, that's dropping down. That'll be difficult for me. Because it's not so much that football changes. It's like Simon says, it's that the world changes. So the thing, people will quite often kind of beat football up for not changing as fast as it could do. But none of the stuff that we now kind of take for granted in terms of data is possible without the DVD. Like, the thing that changes football is the invention of the DVD. Until then, if you'd be some people in the audience who are old enough to remember VHSs, but you can't do data analysis properly off like old school videotapes. It doesn't work. You need digital technology. You also need the internet. And for, like the early 90s, we didn't have the internet. They might have had it in certain places, and the army had it in the States, but they weren't lending it out to people so that they could check the BBC website. Do you know what I mean? All this stuff takes technological change and a cultural shift. So the other thing that I think is really important and probably doesn't get the credit that it deserves is things like computer games, that they teach a generation without any of us really thinking about it, that you can gauge a player's ability out of 20 or 100. That's completely natural. I'm 40. That's completely natural to me, that someone, you should look at a little bit of information and it says, their speed is 17 out of 20 or their passing is 10 out of 20 or whatever. But to a previous generation, that in itself was not intuitive. That wasn't necessarily how people thought about football. So you need those things to happen, and both of those things happen at the same time. So I think fantasy football launches in like 94 with Baddiel and Skinner, and then you get the FIFA games, Football Manager, Championship Manager as it was then, at the same time as you get in the internet, and then in 1998, the DVD suddenly exists. And all of that happens basically in this 4 or 5 year period when you're starting your career. You say coincidentally, who knows, it might have been planned. None of us can tell. But you get this change where football is suddenly ready to think in a different way, but also able to think in a different way. So it's really easy to sit in 2022 and be like, weren't they stupid in the 1980s when they didn't know what an assist was, and they had to have the Americans invent it for them? Graham Kelly, was Graham Kelly the chairman of the FA? Is that what he was?
Chairman of the FA.
Something like that. He was like the football blazer in the 90s.
Yeah.
And he blamed Americans for inventing the assist at the 1994 World Cup. That was what he was really cross about. But a lot of that stuff couldn't have happened in the world that football existed in. People weren't thinking it that way, and they weren't able to glean the data in any real way. And I think that period is fascinating. That's when Opta starts, it was when Prozone starts, which is where you first started. And those companies were at the very cutting edge of it, although at the same time, in a lot of ways, they weren't especially, like, hearing what life was like at Prozone and Opta from the vantage point of 2022 does not make them sound cutting edge at all.
I guess we all kind of consumed data. I mean, when I was growing up, I was addicted to Football Manager. I lost my teenage years to playing Football Manager, and we didn't even realise that, like, Freddie Adu and the fact that Kim Chalstrom never made it big was crestfallen, because his numbers said he should have been, and he scored loads of goals for my team, and that's kind of how we all consume data. But whilst that was all kind of going on at the same time, organisations like Prozone and the game was just starting to get into its infancy. So what was it, chicken and egg sort of thing between all of that? How did that all kind of come in?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, so, so there's always a lag, isn't there, in terms of, like, I suppose professional football would have seen a lot of those sorts of things at that time as gimmicks and as not real and, not credible to be talked about in that scene. So I think, and then, then you've got a generation of people that have grown up with that, and then some of those people will start to come into football, be managers, have position of influence and in media, and it starts to just become more just accepted as a baseline. But there's also things like analytics probably came a little bit after sports science. So as fitness testing came in, it just nudged that door open just to sort of say, look, there's other layers that you can add to just 4-4-2 and coach in aspects of coaching to start to think about this differently. But I always like, there's always been innovative thinkers around the sport, and they might have been more in the minority. It's trendy now, a bit more trendy to be it, and you get labelled a dinosaur. But if Reap and Howard Wilkinson and Dave Bassett and these guys who would have been, it wasn't cool in any way, shape or form, but outperformed the odds doing what they did, which is effectively what we're all trying to do now. And so that, again, just nudging it a little bit, so maybe someone that played in Dave Bassett's team is now a manager and has had that experience and is just a little bit more open to it than the generation before. So a lot of these things are kind of, perfect storm in terms of things coming together at different times. I think in the book it's described well as pulling all these various things that have kind of influenced kind of where we are today.
One of my most depressing realizations in writing the book was that if you were to make a football version of the film Moneyball, with Brad Pitt as Billy Bean, you'd have to get someone to play Sam Allardyce.
Right.
There would be no option. That football film, the football Moneyball film, should be about Sam Allardyce.
Why?
Because Sam Allardyce is the great pioneer. And you're not, like, there was a point on Twitter where he was the only person you could criticize and no one would abuse you. And it was, so if you were having like a bad day, you could tweet about how much you hated Sam Allardyce and everyone would just sort of flood you with love and adoration. It was really like life affirming. But Allardyce was an incredible figure, and it's just a shame that he insisted on telling everyone about it all of the time, because I feel as though that really held him back a little bit.
What if he had managed Real Madrid?
Exactly. He could have been, I mean, they'd have his statue, the whole building would be named after him. But no, Sam Allardyce was cutting edge with sports science. He did a load of sports science stuff that for the mid to late 90s was totally out there. And he was kind of coming up with like relatively sophisticated analytical thoughts from a team of people who are now all intensely powerful within football in the late 90s, which is, I mean, for comparison, is 3 years before the Oakland A's go on the run, influenced by Billy Bean and an on-base percentage. Like, so Allardyce was there before Billy Bean, and he was drawing on the work of people like Charles Reap, but also on that kind of school of thought of Dave Bassett, John Beck, who had the analytical thought that the grass should be longer in the corners. You know, that kind of, those position of maximum opportunity coaches, we all think of as dinosaurs, and to an extent, they were not great aesthetes. I think that's probably fair to say, but they were sophisticated thinkers, and it's a shame. In a way, it's a shame that their football didn't betray that. But maybe we should, at some point, we might end up having to kind of reconsider the role they played in history, particularly Allardyce, because he is really maybe the first modern manager. I actually wonder if you were more naturally inclined to conflict than me, if you were Miguel Delaney, you could make a case that Sam Allardyce is the most influential manager in modern British history is Arsene Wenger. I think Allardyce, you could maybe make a case as second, ahead of Guardiola and Ferguson, which sounds ridiculous. But
who came here today and expected that?
He kind of might be. And I'm not saying I approve of it, but it's just
one thing you're going to take away from today. Rory Smith thinks Sam Allardyce.
These are the facts as they exist. Like he's the real pioneer. So he's just a hero.
Yeah, no, I totally get where you're coming from, and I think that was you needed these other examples of it. For someone like me, who was a young analyst at the time, who was fighting the good fight every day, trying to convince players that I wasn't going to tell on them, and you know, all this sort of stuff. Whereas, you know, and you see, and ultimately Bolton doing well was great for us all. And I always say that when like people got promoted out of that staff, and kicked on to different things. Mike Falk got the performance director's job at Chelsea. That's when it started to become, oh, right, there's some things happening here, there's a use for this, and people are making these moves, and ultimately then you get the copycat stuff that every club does, like, why are they doing that? We should have one of those. But ends up being good for the industry. So, yeah, good on Sam.
But the sports science is really important as well, because that was the other bridgehead. So that kind of happens, late 90s, 96, 97?
Yeah.
People start thinking, maybe these professional athletes shouldn't be in the pub all the time. Maybe if, when Arsene Wenger invented pasta, and everyone thought, this is incredible. That happens at the same time, but that means you've got people in clubs who kind of know how to count and are familiar with numbers and understand that you can measure stuff. And I think that's a really important, philosophical change.
I think the thing, more basic even, is just saying, well, number one, can we outperform our budget? You know, in terms of from a club's perspective, can we outperform our budget? How are we going to hack this system? And just having a very clear identity of what we're going to bring football down to a very basic way of playing, and we'll recruit players against that way of playing. And that kind of line of sight is like what everyone wants to do. That's your basic 101, kind of how to build a football club now. But I suppose before that, everyone thought that it was just this magic that just happened. You just go onto the pitch and see what happens. But at least starting to go, well, hold on, there are some aspects of this we can control and design and try and build.
Because all of this is kind of the reason why we're talking about it today is because obviously, and the reason why we're talking at a literary festival, is your book, Expected Goals, the story of how data conquered football and changed the game forever. Out now?
Now.
Has anybody read it? We do have a couple. So I'll get your opinions in a second, but
Please don't.
one Amazon reviewer said, this is not necessarily, it's kind of like the Daily Mail comment section, isn't it? A little bit. Said, possibly the best football book I've ever read.
Oh, well.
In the wrong hands, this could be a dry subject. Another said, I wish there were another 100 pages. Fantastic
I read
book.
that one, yeah. I'm glad there's not another 100 pages. What a word.
What did you think? Brilliant, really, really. I think that's
Thank
the right thing to say. That is the right thing. So when you were writing the book, I mean, take us through kind of the cultural shift that you kind of noticed, where it kind of started and where it's kind of started to kind of develop. And were there any things that when you were writing it and obviously doing all the research around it that maybe surprised you a little bit?
Well, yeah, so I think that everything starts in kind of the 90s. So you have Charles Reap, who's this ridiculous but also prophetic figure in the 50s and 60s who goes to football matches wearing a miner's headlamp and notes down a set of metrics basically of his own making. That's the first attempt really to annotate football. And he's ignored by football but actually taken very seriously by academia. So I think 1997 he publishes a paper that is, if you speak to the people at Liverpool, still kind of like the foundational text for a lot of football analytics. And that was 97, this kind of, this slightly absurd avuncular figure of Charles Reap. But then you have this big shift in the 90s where, the world changes, they get the DVDs, Sam Allardyce comes along, like Jesus, and everyone's suddenly ready for, the world is ready for it. And then you get Prozone, who were founded in Leeds by a man who used to be chairman of my old cricket club. That's not why I wrote the book.
You name dropper, you.
No, it's amazing. I met him. He's called Ram Milvaganam.
Yeah.
And we met near where my parents live, and he sort of said, "Oh, where are you from originally?" And I said, "I'm from Collingham, just down the road." And he went, "Oh, I used to be chairman of Collingham and Linton Cricket Club." And I never thought I'd write a book that mentioned Collingham and Linton Cricket Club, but I have. And that basically means I can retire. But anyway, so you get Prozone who come along as this kind of, Ram decides that he wants to film games effectively and then annotate them. That was kind of his idea, wasn't it? So he's going to set up all these cameras around pitches and draw the data out. But Ram has absolutely no background in data, doesn't like football, didn't own any cameras. It was like a proper kind of fly-by. I mean, Ram's a real like grade A entrepreneur, and it works, and he's now worth millions. And that is a lesson in capitalism. And then you get Opta at the same time, who are kind of more famous probably than Prozone now, which is a marketing stunt. Opta's set up by a consulting firm who wants to advertise their consulting services, and they get Don Howe in to make up 92 different metrics for how you win football matches off the top of his head. And I didn't know Don Howe, but I imagine he saw that was a way to earn some money, very easy money, very quickly, and did it without really thinking it was important. But that, it turns out, was the foundation of a whole industry, effectively. And Opta was a big .com darling, but didn't really kind of operate in any logical way. And the stories that you hear from the early days of Opta and Prozone are nuts. So Opta had an office at Victoria in London, the subterranean lair, where they all sort of slept on sofas and stuff. And they'd bring the tapes of games in, and then they'd have to watch them and pause them, as these still videos, pause them every few seconds and tick the pass. Or it might have been a checkbox thing. Pass, tackle, pass, and it took hours. And then someone else would check it, but because they had to drive the tapes down, no internet, if you were Spurs, you'd get your game, your analysis back the next day, but if you were Leeds, you'd have to wait till the Post on Tuesday. It's a further example of the North-South divide. And and then they get bought by somebody and they move to this fancy office opposite the Bank of England, but they still only have one internet connection. So Duncan Alexander, who works at Opta, said to me that it used to be like watching villagers queue for the well, because they had to sort of go and get their research from the internet. And they'd stand waiting for the internet, like the internet god, to kind of descend upon them. And these companies basically they dominated this space. And that's the first point at which data gets a foothold into football. And to be honest, from there, it probably takes another...
So what's this, 2001?
So I reckon by 2001, 2002, the time that Moneyball's starting to happen in baseball, you have data exists in football.
Yeah.
You would have been at Preston by that stage.
Yeah, just finished at Preston, about to go to Southampton.
Yeah.
Yep.
So most clubs had analysts of some sort.
Yeah, so the model was at that time that most people bought Prozone, which was a software and a software package. I don't know how many people were familiar with it, but like Rory said, it recreated the game from a 2D bird's eye perspective, and it coded everything that happened, so it gave you a load of events. But at that time, the one thing it did that was unique to the industry, it started to generate running stats, so distance covered and high intensity distance, number of sprints, all that sort of stuff. So very, very expensive at the time for clubs. But so what happens was, and obviously no one in the clubs knew how to probably turn a laptop on or how to read the data. So what happened was the company sold the software and an analyst went with them to the clubs. And so, I was one of those where the system was sold initially to Preston North End with David Moyes, and then David went off to Everton. I went off to, and the system got sold into Southampton, and I relocated to Southampton and went work with them. So that was an example of how it happened. And by that time, probably 2002, there might have been 10 clubs out of across the Championship and the Premier League and national teams. And then it grew steadily to the point where every team in the Premier League and every team in the Championship and some teams outside of that would have had Prozone and would have had an analyst.
And when you're going into the clubs, how well received are you? Because there's this kind of school of thought that you've got this old coach that's been doing it 20 years, that knows how football works, that played X amount of games as a professional, went into coaching, went into management, and he knows how football works, and he doesn't need somebody like you coming in and telling him that the players need to run more.
Yeah. No, I'd say the main the main feeling when you walked in the room was suspicion of what you were going to bring up, what we're going to show. And I mean, in that era, as Rory said, that the video was brought out as a punishment. So you know, if the team lost 3-0 at the weekend, they'd watch the full 90 minutes on video, and then you'd have comedy situations where the manager's trying to get to one particular clip, but you've got a forward and then just slightly mistimes it, so it goes back and slightly mistimes it going back. So those sessions could take 3 hours, and they weren't pleasant. So I was probably just seen as a more sophisticated way of hammering the players. And yeah, I suppose that was what I tried to do, is try to showcase the benefits to the players, sell them in, say, okay, this is actually going to show the good stuff you do, not just the bad stuff you're going to do, and actually shows your role in the team. We help you prepare you for your opponent, that type of thing, and over time. But it was, I had some battle scars for sure, and so did the rest of my kind of colleagues that were out there with other teams.
Is there kind of a fear that you're doing the traditional football people out of jobs?
Yes, I think so. I think. Look, it's a changing room can be a bit of a playground at times, in terms of, you've got it's a sort of a survival type environment, and the best way to survive is in numbers, isn't it? So I think that if at times you'd have, whether it was coaching staff, whether it was groups of players, that would find sort of safety in numbers and just sort of kind of try to take the piss or try to just like ridicule it a little bit. So yeah, it was some difficult team meetings, and it was some difficult times, but I think with a bit of good humour and ultimately just with a bit of persistence, and in the end of the day, showing the value of it positively, as well as the influence of Bolton doing well, and it being featured on Match of the Day and all that sort of stuff. Slowly it becomes a bit unarguable. It's not going away, and actually let's just try and, this can help me, so I'm going to start using it.
I think there's a media thing as well that's important, which sounds like journalistic self-promotion, but if anyone remembers Andy Townsend's tactics truck when ITV had the highlights rather than Match of the Day, that used Prozone technology.
Yeah.
And that, I think, got Prozone into the public imagination as a thing that existed within football. So that would have been 2003, I think, that ITV had that. And it was seen as very nerdy and a bit kind of unnecessary. And there were loads of other problems with ITV having the highlights, largely the fact it was on at 7 o'clock in the evening, which people didn't like. And also why they put Andy Townsend in a truck I think remained...
It made the pitch blue, I don't know if you remember that. But
yeah. Remained a bit of a mystery. Why does he have to be in a truck? Why couldn't he just be in a studio? There's no reason for this. But that kind of exposure, I think, was really important. And at the same time as that was happening, Opta, who were always media-facing, were starting to sort of sell more and more numbers to papers, not just because papers were more interested in it, but because football was bigger, so you needed more stuff to fill the paper. And ultimately, I mean, anyone who's read the British media will know that, you know, basically any old shit can get in if it's 600 words, because you've got a big hole to fill, so that'll do. And yeah, you speak to people who were working at Opta at the time, and they kind of get calls from tabloid news desks in evening games with 15 minutes to play saying, give me the numbers. And they'd say, well, the game's not finished yet, so we don't have the numbers. We can't give you the numbers. And they'd say, well, just give me any numbers. I don't really care what the numbers say, but I want them in my paper. And I think that all of that, although I suspect that some of the data drawn from Opta's best guesses with 80 minutes to play of Coventry against Bolton were maybe not that reliable, but that kind of exposes more people to data. More people realise this is something that's happening within football, and it becomes a language that we talk about football in. And I think that's really important, that as soon as fans start discussing it. And the one thing you asked about realisations, the figure of Stato on the original fantasy football, I believe it has since been relaunched. But Anders Lochran played Stato, who was this kind of, he wore like a Hugh Hefner dressing gown and glasses.
I thought you were going to say cardigan then, I was worried.
No, it was like a silk dress, like a kimono,
it was, yeah.
sort of.
It was like the guy that stays up all night, hasn't got a life.
Yeah. But so he was the butt of the joke a lot of the time, but I think the reason it worked was just everyone kind of knew people who would absorb football like that, like who could tell you, this is the fourth time, the sort of John Motson stat, this is the fourth time since the war that West Brom have scored 3 goals at Goodison Park. And you think, well, was that used in the team tour? Look, we did this in 1947, lads. We can definitely do it again. And I think that shows there were people out there, even before this stuff happened, who were statistically inclined with football in a way that exists like really naturally with like baseball. Everyone thinks about baseball like that in the States. With football, it's much rarer. And that market was being sort of treated to what it wanted, but also it was expanding. And I think people realised that. What there wasn't until a little bit later was any attempt to go, this Simon will know more than me about this, but a lot of the managers and the analysts in that era said that basically the numbers were used as a form of accountability. It was what the managers realised pretty quickly was, this can show me who is working hard enough and who is not. So the running, the distance covered, the high intensity sprints, it was a really easy way. You could put it into a league table, and footballers understand league tables. So he ran the most, he ran the least, you're in trouble. That was kind of the way that it kind of manifested initially. Anything more in depth had to wait a little bit, I guess.
Yeah. I was going to say, we're sitting here today talking about data, XG and sprints and this. What are the metrics and things that you are measuring and looking out for, and how has that kind of changed in the last 20 years? Because
this is your secret sauce now. This is what's getting Stockport through the league. You need to give this away.
Look, I think where we started 20 years ago was just counting stuff. So like Reet would have been in, just counting what's happening, just describing what's happening in the game. And then we've gone through a process of going kind of, so what? Like and what does this tell me? So we've had 12 crosses and they've had 3. So what? And it goes back to kind of like, well, who won the game? The most, you'd hear that a lot. The most important stat is who scored, exactly. Absolutely right. So then, then you've got to work backwards from that in terms of say, well, what increases your chances of scoring goals? What increases your chances of that happening? And just keep working back so you get to the really granular stuff at the sides. And then, you almost get a hierarchy of stats, depending on your style, depending on what you're trying to do, of things that become really influential in the outcome of, not always the game, but in the outcome of your performance. And so, when did XG come about?
So I think from about 2009, there were people who had models that were, XG was kind of it wasn't what they were looking for. They were basically, after sort of 2007, 2008, you get various people, a lot of them sort of outside football, looking for a variation of what is now called expected possession value or expected value possession or something. It basically, what Simon mentioned, it's trying to work out what happens before the thing that leads to the goal. Like, what do you do in any given situation that increases your team's chances of scoring? And that, at the moment, is the closest thing that football has to what Billy Bean and the Sabermetricians found of OBI did. You need to find something that can increase your ability to tell the players, if you do this in this situation, you are more likely to score a goal. Not you will score a goal, but you are more likely to. And the first stage of working that out was, right, where do goals come from? And to do that, you need to measure the quality of shots, and which is what XG is. So you then get, I think by 2009-ish, they've got a similar sort of formula at Arsenal. There's one at Spurs. The one that catches on is Sam Green's XG model. Sam worked for Opta, and I think he wrote a blog about it in 2011 that is kind of credited with bringing XG into the public domain. But there were people working on it before, though no one had given it such a catchy name, although I think there's quite a lot of people who would prefer it to be called something else now, because they feel as though it's become stigmatised.
Do you secretly detest the term XG?
No, there's people within the data community who think it's not that helpful. I've always kind of not understood why there are fans who get aggravated by that one metric in particular, because I think it's such an intrinsic thing that any fan understands, that it's like, after a game, you watch a football match, your team play, one of your thoughts is, we got a bit lucky because they had a load of chances, or we lost despite the fact that we had loads of chances. That's all XG measures, is whether you're right to think that and to what extent you should think that. And I think that's putting a number. The number can seem a bit arbitrary and people don't like fractions, but it just seems like such an obvious thing that we all do as fans anyway. It's like objecting to counting corners. Well, I don't like this. We don't care about the fact we had 12 corners. Like, it's just how many corners there were. It's fine. And I've never quite understood why that is such a source of tension, but it is, and it was a risk calling the book that, to be fair. So a lot of people want to bought it because they don't like the title. But then that Opta model kind of becomes the standard that gets into the media, because Opta have deals with newspapers and TV channels to provide information for them. And then by 2017, I think, the BBC and Sky in the same summer decide to put XG on their screens, which you think would be a really small thing, because obviously on like Match of the Day you see it's like the score, the attendance, the yellow cards, the red cards, shots, as they're interviewing the manager or whatever, and you think, well, who cares what's in that yellow thing? But I spoke to the producers of Match of the Day. It took them like 2 years to decide to do it. Like, all the meetings they had to have. Do you think people will go for this? Do you think they'll mind this little yellow box that you do not have to read? And then ages and ages, and like even at Sky, I think they had these intense conversations about it, because people are so kind of wary of changing anything in football. But that's based on the Opta model. So if you're using that, it's 2011. It kind of gets invented, I think.
Yeah. But I think inherently in the game we'll be talking about the better coach, the more forward-thinking coaches you would see would be trying to create shooting or scoring opportunities that had high probabilities. You remember Arsenal's team under Wenger would never cross the ball. It would always be cutbacks.
And that would infuriate fans. Just like, why are you passing it so much?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And so, yeah, and I don't know, he wouldn't have had the data to back it up. It would have been a theory that he's putting into action through the team and through the recruitment. And the whole idea is to create high probability goal scoring chances rather than low probability ones, which now XG just helps us describe that.
Was it Howard Wilkinson or Howard Kendall? You basically never let his players take long shots. They'd always say pass it, put it into the box.
That definitely would not be Howard Wilkinson. No, but like long shots are one of this is getting a little bit off topic, but like long shots have declined massively in the last 10 years.
And do you think that's because of the data?
Well, so I think you can't for certain establish causality, but I think so. It could be a kind of Guardiola-inflected everyone likes to pass, and a kind of belief that it's a last option of last resort. Although I think a lot of the time now you see long shots because players are told to finish attacks. That if the attacks are broken down and you're 30 yards out, you might as well have a pop and either score or fire it miles over, because you'd much rather face a goal kick than a counter attack. Yeah. So long shots will always exist as a kind of, right, we've run out of choices, smash it. kind of option. But I think between the stylistic kind of dominance of Barcelona and that school and a more data-driven approach, I think people have worked out that actually, do you know what, that shot from 30 yards, probably, they don't go in that often, do they? We don't see a lot of those every game, so maybe do them less. It's the opposite of you might have seen the NBA shot map from the last 10 years since the Golden State Warriors started being dominant, and before it was everywhere on a basketball court. But now you either shoot from directly beneath the hoop or the three-point line. No one shoots in between. There's just no shots. Basketball teams do not shoot from there. I think if you did a similar sort of plot for football, you'd see lots of shots in the box. 10, 15 years ago, you'd see, 30% of shots or something from outside the box, 70% inside. Now it would be 10% of shots from outside the box and 90% inside, because people know that you shouldn't be shooting from long range a lot unless you really have to.
And who are the people, who are the brains behind all of this? Because is it mathematicians?
Simon.
Simon for a lot of. But like, where are we getting these people? Like I say, they've grown up kind of in that football manager sort of generation, that have grown up in this stats era, that had kind of started to come into the game. What's their background and how are they getting into it?
So the newest generation are coming from the top mathematicians, top institutions in the world. It's gone through stages to get to that kind of place, and there's been different things that have influenced it. I mean, certainly not in my era. Coming in, being able to use a calculator was an advantage. But yeah, I think so. What kind of happened, I suppose, in and around the sort of 2010, 2011 kind of era. Football analysis had been well established at clubs, but football, there's a difference between sort of an analysis, which I would call as video analysis, and some basic statistical event data, and analytics, which would sort of cluster events data to try to get to new meaning. There's like really meaningful stats that describe stuff, and it needed a different level of intelligence to be able to do that, and to do it with statistical significance and not just finger in the air stuff. And a lot of that was driven, from America in terms of baseball, but also basketball, ice hockey, that fundamentally just understood these, or were searching for that kind of holy grail of who's the most valuable player, those sorts of things. Well, who is it and why? And so to be able to try and describe that, they use data, and they'd be, very, very good, just, I suppose, mathematical concepts about value, and that coming in. And a lot of that came in through, it was outside of football clubs, and it became like a data journalism. So a lot of it was online. And it wasn't until clubs started to embrace that a little bit, where those practitioners, those experts started to come into the sport.
There's an element to it as well, Rory, that actually some of these data scientists that are coming into the game have got not really no knowledge of football, but no kind of intrinsic understanding of it, and that's actually almost to their benefit.
Yeah, I think that if you're dealing exclusively with the numbers, then you don't need to necessarily understand what they do. There's a guy called Luke Bourne who worked at Roma and is now... He's involved with Billy Bean, so helping run Toulouse, I think, in France, and I presume will eventually end up helping to run AC Milan. And his academic background was in studying the migratory patterns of bison, which I think is really relevant experience for the championship. I think that really kind of and then you've got kind of. There's a guy who worked at CERN on the Large Hadron Collider at Liverpool. I think Man City have got someone who was an astrophysicist at Yale. That they are, I suspect they're all.
It's a logical career path, isn't it?
Well, it is. I suspect it is in terms of money. There's a lot more money in football than there is in bison. I guess they're all football fans. My instinct is that I don't know, but my instinct is you wouldn't seek a job in football if you are kind of that highly qualified in a field that can be that lucrative if you don't like the sport. There's a lot of physicists who are quants on like Wall Street banks and City banks, and they do that because there's a lot more money in banking than there is in academia. I don't think they do it because they kind of grew up with like a JP Morgan Chase scarf on their walls, dreaming of working for Wachovia. But with football, my guess is that if you're doing it, you probably you're doing it because you want to be involved with the sport. And Billy Bean, who I spoke to for the book, said that his sort of great source of pride is that baseball now recruits from the same field as Goldman Sachs and Google. They're the same people going for the same jobs. You either, you might go and work for the Astros, or you might work for, some massive financial institution or some tech giant. But it's all the same skill sets. They're all doing the same stuff. And I think football is getting towards that slowly. There's obviously, a lot of people who are incredibly intelligent, incredibly kind of mathematically literate, also love football.
Just to finish off this half of it, you both of you kind of touched upon the American sports there. I think that's kind of seen, Moneyball and everything that kind of happened around Oakland is seen as the birth of it, or the gold standard sort of thing. Where is football's place in kind of the global landscape of sport in terms of its use of data analytics and statistics? And has it kind of been born purely out of baseball and American sports? And are we kind of still learning where we're going with football? Have we reached our ceiling with our use of data and everything?
No, I think I suppose globally you look at more kind of linear cultures like the US and UK in terms of people that would like to understand logic and like to build that kind of reasoning behind stuff. And I think in your Latin countries, I think still is a challenge it's because it's seen as art, and it's seen as the value of it is explained differently. So I think us and the US are leading. I think football is a much more random sport than a lot of the other sports. So obviously baseball, it's a lower scoring sport than basketball. So there's so much randomness still in our sport that it can only still amount to so much. It can only explain so much, and that would be a little bit of its limiting factor. But because of the value of succeeding in football in this country, just doing it 1% better is lucrative. So, and there's enough money to fund really good stuff now, and there's good, academic institutions that can support it as well. So, I do think football will help accelerate it. English football will help accelerate it. But I wouldn't say we've got a handful of very rich clubs, very smart clubs. We're not 92 clubs are like that. Whereas you'd think of all of American sport has probably got some form of this to a higher level than we've got it across the board, if that makes sense.
I think it's one of the things that struck me writing the book was that a lot of the people who work in analytics, especially if they are of that kind of type of person who's extremely kind of number driven, who's deeply analytical, people who've worked at Microsoft or Google or wherever, is how kind of downbeat they are about how far behind football is. And so I had lots and lots of conversations with people saying, we wasted our opportunity. Arsenal could have been the Oakland A's of football in 2009. We wasted our opportunity. Spurs, even earlier, wasted our opportunity. You speak to people involved or people on the outside who are kind of closely connected to it, and they'll tell you, look, no one's doing any good stuff. Everyone's thick. No one understands what they're doing. You speak to the clubs that are doing it, and they'll tell you that all the other clubs that are doing it are shit. And you ask Brentford about Brighton, like, no, there's no data at Brighton. You ask Brighton, who work on Star Lizard's data, so have probably got the most sophisticated data in the world. They're like, well, no one else does it, and no one is even trying. I spoke to someone at Toulouse who was like, well, we think there's a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 is like where data is kind of inculcated in every decision you make, and we think Liverpool are a 3. And you're like, really? Do you really think that, or are you just slagging off another football team? And then the more of those conversations I had, the more it kind of made me think that it can be hard to see the wood for the trees. So I think honestly, those people believe those things sincerely, that football could be doing a lot more, and football can do a lot more. And I think the consensus is probably that it's not even really tapped the potential. Not that there isn't a magic Moneyball data point. I don't think there's a metric that will solve football. If that's what people are waiting for, they'll be disappointed. But you look at the changes that have been wrought from the XG on Match of the Day, from the fact that we now know what assists are, to the fact that you've got clubs every club uses Y Scout and Scout 7 and Instat and whatever to do their due diligence on signings. Even if that's all they do, most clubs, even down to League 1 and League 2, will have some sort of digital platform to do their scouting. They will be doing due diligence on signings by checking players against some sort of numerical database. The numbers that they have access to might be absolutely dreadful, and they might be made up by someone, they might be completely meaningless, but they are doing it, and that is huge progress, and you shouldn't lose sight of the progress because you know what the potential is, I think. And the other thing is, I think that football maybe beats itself up too much about being slow on the uptake. 2002, the A's go on their winning streak, and that kind of starts the Moneyball revolution. The Red Sox try and hire Billy Beane that summer or the summer after. But by that stage, Opta existed, Prozone existed, Sam Allardyce existed. There was all this stuff happening. And even now, I think there are baseball teams who don't believe in analytics, who don't have any real interest in doing it properly. Whereas if you look at football, it's pretty widespread, and it's become pretty widespread in about 20 years, which is, for a sport that can be very resistant to change, actually quite impressive. So I wrote the book, I finished writing the book feeling a lot more kind of upbeat than most of the people in it, which is slightly strange.
Well, maybe our readers will feel a little bit more upbeat having read it as well. We are going to pause there. We're going to take a 10-minute break that will probably end up turning into a 15-minute break. The bar is open at the back. Go use the toilets, do whatever you need to do. Recharge, refresh. We'll come back, have another quick kind of 10-minute chat, and then we'll open up the floor to you guys. So please give a round of applause to Simon and to Rory for the first half. And we'll be back with you very shortly. Thank you very much. Have we lost anyone? That's always the good testament when they come back after the break, I think. You've done well with the first half. Right, we're going to do 10 minutes, quick chat, finish off what we're talking about, and then we're going to open the floor to you guys. So we're going to kick off this little section talking about where we are in 2022. We've talked about all of the data. What are we doing with it?
I suppose data, you're probably going to see it in a couple main features of the club. There's been a much more attention paid now to recruitment and players that get signed, talent that clubs should sign, can't sign, the value that players that has been paid for players, and that lends itself really well to analytics because it's all around evaluation. So that's probably one of the main area that analytics and data gets associated to as well. But as well as that, huge emphasis on the training element. So the loading of players, and making sure that the players have done just the right amount of training to be in peak physical condition throughout the season. And paying particular attention to sort of injury management. So if the players have been overloaded and are at a higher risk of injury, tapering down their training, or in some cases is tapering it up to ensure that they're robust enough to deal with the
how low down the food chain does that go? Like, kind of obviously Premier League are doing that, but even at...
Yeah, no, we're doing that at Stockport, and we're not alone doing that. I think every club in League 2 will have it, and even last year when we were in the National League, you would say probably every club had access to, it's called GPS, so yeah, they have access to that. Our under-18s have it as well now, so look, it's just so helpful. It just allows you to get on the front foot and make sure that you're managing injury risk. And certainly with our identity at Stockport, we want to be a front foot team and an energetic team, and we want to be a team that's really intense in terms of our work rate. So we can't just say that, we need to measure it and back it up. So that tool helps us do it all the way through. And yeah, that wouldn't be we wouldn't be too dissimilar to any other club.
I think the key thing, like the next hurdle for most clubs is, I would say most teams have some form of access to data, probably even relatively low down the food chain. They'll all kind of look at it. There won't be many transfers made in the Premier League or Championship. Someone's not thinking, okay, let's check to see if there's any left backs better than this guy. Like no one would sign. Well, maybe Man United. Other than that, no one would sign. Very few teams, I think, would sign a player without at least performing some sort of rudimentary check that might be ignored because like George Mendes has a client he wants you to sign. But for the most part, I think everything goes through that due diligence. Even Sevilla, where Monchi, who's the sporting director, is this kind of archetypal, continental like transfer guru, knows everybody, found Dani Alves on a bus, signed Luis Fabiano when he was a fetus or something, you know, all this incredible record. But even Sevilla have invested quite a lot of money in artificial intelligence and trying to build their own sort of data banks and their own kind of ability to read the data. So I think it's starting to apply across Europe as well. The difference now isn't just how smart the people you have reading it are, it's whether you are looking for something consistently and you have an idea of what you want. So you can have the best access to the best data in the world and the smartest nuclear physicists in the world. But if you continually change what sort of left back you want, then all of that will be meaningless. You need to know where you're going and what you're doing. That's the thing that I think football struggles with, rather than access to the data or even really appetite to read it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that the best clubs are the most aligned clubs from top to bottom, and that means that they share a central idea that they commit to. And I think it is, like we say, it's a very random sport, so it is like card counting in the sense that you want to, you're never going to get 100% success rate, but you might be able to get to 57%, if you know what I mean. And if you apply that again and again and again and again, your chances of success go up. So sticking to one consistent idea and repeating it and excelling at it. And also, if you stick to one set of narrow principles, your chances of improving are higher than if you set to a lot of principles.
What are the clubs that are doing this well at the minute?
So I think there's 3 in England that you can pretty objectively say have made a success of data, and 2 of them are the gambling clubs, so Brentford and Brighton. And they're probably the truest data clubs. I think there's more, even Brentford's a bit funny. There's a lot of kind of like marginal gain stuff at Brentford and like what people call performance culture, which should really exist at every professional sports team, to be honest, but apparently doesn't. There's a lot of that stuff at Brentford as well, but I think they are quite data-driven in a lot of ways. And then the other one that's maybe a notch down from them is Liverpool. And I think the argument that is made in the book, but is, was disagreed with by the New Statesman, is that I think you need I think football doesn't work like American sports. So the Oakland A's never won a World Series. Billy Beane never took the Oakland A's and got a big trophy. And if Billy Beane had been a football manager, someone would have said, well, yeah, but what did he win? Because that's how football works. Football doesn't respond to they've had a really good season. It responds to where's your medals. It's a really kind of brutal sport. It's much more brutal in American sports. It was the MLS final last night, which LAFC won. But they'd already won the Supporters' Shield, so you can win a trophy in America for getting to a semi-final. And that is quite indicative of the American attitude to sports. So the A's didn't win a World Series that year, but they won a pennant. And that counts. They can hang their pennant in the stadium, and that's their reward. We don't really have that in football. Like if you are a big club and you have a great season, Spurs in the year that Leicester won the league, the narrative became that Spurs bottled it. Tottenham finished 3rd. That's not bottling it, that's Tottenham finishing 3rd. That's amazing. And they only finished 3rd because they lost heart in the last 3 weeks and got smashed by Newcastle, and Arsenal overtook them. Football doesn't think about stuff like that very intelligently, I think. So you end up with this sort of world where any idea that doesn't deliver a quadruple is a failure. And that isn't a particularly healthy environment. So I think football needed someone like Liverpool to come along, and although they're not as data-driven as Brentford and Brighton, they said, we are using data. And Ian Graham, the director of research, has got a little bit more public face in the last few years. He's more willing to talk. He's more kind of well-known. We know that Liverpool use data in some of their decision-making processes. You can debate how good their data is or how sophisticated or whatever, but they were the first truly high-profile team, apart maybe from Manchester City, and that's a complicated example, to come out and say, we are using data, and here are the trophies we've won with it. And I think that was really important for football.
Just very quickly, before we finish up, the player power in all of the data, because the thing is, players get access to, I think Casemiro when he was at Real Madrid, kept coming off at full time, and was constantly wanting to know like his how many dispossessions he'd had, or where he's picking up the ball, how many meters he's running, this, that, and the other. Like players want to know their data quite significantly. One, from just because they want to know how well they've done, but also actually in this transfer market these days, they want to use this data as leverage for making transfers and increasing their value, don't they?
Yeah, 100%. They want to, there's, and it is leverage, and it depends on how well, like negotiation is all about preparation from either side. So if you've got something that is, that you can pull over the other side, then you're going to use it. I think what probably where it's got to now is that both sides have got it, both sides understand it, and it becomes just a way of finding that middle ground. So we can say, we already know that about you, but we also know that so-and-so is stronger than you, and you've got to apply different context around it. Like last year I was negotiating with our goalkeeper who kept 18 clean sheets, but it was saying, would you have done that without us spending that amount of money on the rest of the team? So you can use it both ways, but certainly it's more common, and certainly the agencies are all across it and using it a lot.
Yeah, most of the agencies I think now have dedicated a sort of data team to read things. Yeah. And I know that so Kai Havertz, when he was at Leverkusen, and this sort of golden boy of German football, obviously had every club in Europe after him, and his agents, who were quite young and quite forward-thinking, they commissioned a sort of study to find out the areas of the pitch that Havertz needed to occupy most frequently to play his best, which is what a good agent should do. This is where you need to be. This is how you shine as a player, and they used that to then work out which of the teams that were pitching for his services would be suitable and which wouldn't be. So that they ended up at Chelsea. Not just because Chelsea presumably paid him a lot of money and it's London and all that, but because they thought that fitted his style best. And they ruled out Barcelona because the areas that Kai Havertz occupies at the time were occupied by a little Argentinian man. And they figured, well, he's probably not going to play ahead of that little Argentinian man, so he can't go there. And that, I think, will become more and more common, that the agents will use data to say, the good agents will use data to say, this is where... this is a good deal for you. This is a good place for you to be. This is where you will thrive. We can, in some way, gauge that.
We talked about the clubs that are doing it well, the Brentfords, Brightons, and Liverpools. Are there any clubs that are doing it badly?
Do you have to be diplomatic?
Look, I think the thing about any type of these extra part, this is diplomatic, is where it's not aligned. You can have experts in rooms. If the door's shut and no one's talking to them, there's no use. And there are certain clubs. There are many clubs where that happens. And I think that where it's really built in, and you'd rather have two metrics that really matter to the football club and are done in a very basic way than 100 that are very, very scientific and kept in a box.
Finishing off then, is football better or worse for having all of this data? When we think back to the 60s and the 70s, the golden age of football.
When they didn't have the assist. People must have been so baffled wondering who created the goals. They must have just found it really confusing to think that goal just kind of
Wingers must have been so underpaid back then.
Yeah, they would have been, but then they only had... Stanley Matthews just ran to the byline and crossed it. He didn't care whether anyone was standing in the box. It was an easy job. I think it's better because there's lots and lots of ways to enjoy football. That is kind of the glory of it. From the outside, whether Simon can speak to whether it's better from the inside or not. I think from the outside, you can enjoy football because you like 30-yard screamers. You can enjoy football because you like transfer gossip. You can enjoy football because you like the great man theory of history. You can enjoy football for a million different reasons. And this just offers you another one. If you happen to have a brain that finds the context of that numbers can provide, offers you more clarity, then it's a way, it kind of opens football for you. And I think one of the great things that's happened inside is that the spectrum of voices inside football has changed dramatically. So one of the stories in the book is a kid called Ashwin Raman, who was a 16-year-old in Bangalore in India, and he was blogging as a 13-year-old, and a guy who worked for St Johnston which is in Perth, which is not in India, they noticed his blog and thought, do you know what, actually this is quite smart, there's some stuff here, maybe we could get him to do some stuff, not knowing he was a 13-year-old. People in football don't readily approach 13-year-olds on the internet. But I think by the time Ashwin was
Second
16,
thing to take away from today. Sam Allardyce is the Messiah. Don't approach 13-year-olds.
But I think by the time he was 16 or 17, he was at school in Bangalore during the day, and then he was doing these projects for St Johnstone on recruitment and on strategy at night. And obviously St Johnstone, a tiny club, they're working on a massive budget. Stevie, the guy who was running that aspect of their model at the time, didn't have a huge amount of money to play with, and he tried to find talented people from outside football who would do it for, you know, a small fee and a bit of exposure and a bit of access to the data that he had. And I think the fact that at some point Ashwin Raman, who's now at university in Delhi, might be able to go to a club and say, look, I did this with St Johnstone, what do you think? That's incredible. That's really important for football, because for far too long, the only people who had voices in football were people who used to play football, and they don't necessarily always have the best ideas. So that kind of democratization, I think, has definitely improved it. That to me is the main impact that data has already had on football.
I agree with all those points. Loads of good points. It's brought some great talent into the sport, some different talent. It's allowed people from other sports to come into football and also go out elsewhere. So it's made it a more of an open field of expertise. I think inside the game, sometimes I get frustrated with the way that sometimes data by its nature, because it's a solid and objective number, can shout a bit. So it can shout down other creative parts of the club where, because you can measure it and you can say it, it's more proven. Then you can say, well, again, our culture or our connectivity or our atmosphere, those sorts of things, they sometimes get fluffed out of it, if you know what I mean, because you can't measure it. I think that's, not always great. And, also just think that we shouldn't downplay the incredible abilities that humans have to identify things and influence change. So I remember hearing a top scout speak on a stage like this. He was saying, and he was playing devil's advocate a little bit to a data guy, if you like. So the data guy was talking about how, his process is this long and he covers this amount of players and can do all these things. And he said, well, if I can go to a game and in 5 minutes tell you who's the best player, well, which one's quicker, which one's better, and I can speak to their parent, and, so you can still churn through and get to what you need to get done by just doing it the good old way. So I think what we've got to do is try and make sure that everything's complementing each other and try and raise standards. I think data's been good in terms of it definitely asks better questions. But to get the best out of the data, you've got to ask the best questions out of the data as well. And
you can read all about this in the book called Expected Goals, the story of how data conquered football and changed the game forever. Out now in all good bookstores.
And in bad ones, to be fair.
Anything else?
Ones that don't pay their taxes, it's in all of them.
What particularly are we going to get from the book?
There's a good joke about Paul the Octopus. That's my main selling point. Say a good joke. There's a joke about Paul the Octopus. Is it a good joke? Yeah.
Yeah. No, one second his head. No.
It's all right.
One nod.
You don't often.
You don't remember the joke? No, you missed the joke.
Don't often get a reference to Paul the Octopus these days. People have forgotten him. I'm trying to bring him back. Him and Sam Allardyce. No, I think it's a book. It's not a book about numbers. That's the main thing. It's a book about people and people who have ideas and who, including Simon, who've tried to or accidentally change things maybe more than they know.
Brilliant. Guys, thank you very much. Round of applause for Rory and Simon. We are going to open the floor to you guys. Sam's going to come around with a microphone. We're not going to kind of point out, so if you've got your hand in the air, Sam will come find you, and then, so we've got one there, we'll start off there. Once the question's been asked, just stick your hand in the air, Sam will come find you with a microphone, and we'll just kind of roll it on like that. So, brilliant. First, if you just say your name and then your question, just introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Ben. Huge thanks for that. I thought it was fascinating, really interesting. I think my question is, I'm old enough to remember Nicky Summerby on Record Breakers having the hardest shot ever recorded, but I'm also geeky enough to know that eye tracking exists. So my question really is, what are the measures that are absolutely no use in terms of kind of tracking performance of players? And what are the things that you can't measure yet, but you'd love to see happen in the future?
I think the hardest shot is a really important metric. I think there's not enough emphasis put on the ability to kick a ball really hard. It's a massive advantage in football if you can really smack a football.
For penalties, certainly.
Yeah, free kicks.
Yeah.
Just clearing defenders out of the way.
Yeah. Bit of shithousery, getting it, smacking it at people.
My guess is, you can answer this question more than I can, but my guess is it's knowing that they're all useful if you read them in the right way. So we were talking before actually about corners. That corners initially were kind of dismissed as being really inefficient. It's like 1 in every 400 corners or something leads to a goal. But then if you sort of stop and think about it a little bit more, then maybe if you get a lot better at corners, you get quite a lot of free chances. So corners, that's why quite a lot of Brighton, Brentford and Liverpool will all have a degree of emphasis on set pieces, because although it's not sexy and it's not attractive, quite a good way of scoring goals, and that's kind of what you need to do. So I think it's about knowing, from someone who doesn't have that kind of data brain, it's about knowing what limits the information you have tells you. So you might have a team that runs really far, but it's different if you have a team that runs really far with the ball and a team that runs really far because it doesn't have the ball. To be honest, if you don't have the ball, you should be running quite a long way. Just you need to get the ball back, otherwise nothing can happen. So I think it's to do with being able to read the different bits of information and get meaning from them.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think anything can be useful if it's got a purpose to a bigger picture and to an outcome. So eye tracking, yes, if you're teaching young 9-year-olds to check their shoulder and have scanning the pitch is useful. Is it useful on the second half of the cup final when you're 1-0 down? Probably not. So just the context of it. But I think what expected goals has done is it brings us back to is it going to move the dial? Is it going to make us improve our chances of winning? And then you have to weight that stat appropriately. So if you're going to spend time, effort, and money on it, how much is it going to get you closer to increasing your chances of winning the football match, or developing a player, or depending on what your outcome is to do? So. I don't know if that gets you your answer on that, but there's a lot of things out there and new things being created all the time, but it's got to be purposeful, and it's got to be able to be something that actually is going to move the dial.
After Bundesliga games, the Bundesliga provide lots of stats, one of which is fastest player, and it's the player who at some point in the game, they don't tell you when, ran the fastest. I think that's not a very useful stat. That would be my answer. That is not. Who has the highest top speed is not a particularly useful stat. Yeah.
Wasn't there something posted online the other day? It was I think it was Darwin Núñez and Haaland. There was who's quicker, and it was like Núñez runs 32.2 miles an hour, Haaland runs 32.3.
Yeah, that is seeking.
Well, it's clearly Haaland.
Yeah,
it runs fine.
No, I think Núñez has recorded the highest speed ever in the Premier League, which is it was Kyle Walker, which makes complete sense because Kyle Walker is absolutely rapid. But I don't know what Darwin Núñez was doing when he ran that fast. I don't know why he ran that fast, but he did. But I don't know what. That's a kind of isolate.
You take 60 metres to get up to the top speed. Surely you want someone that's quick over the foot. Maybe that's a more useful thing. The acceleration.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, that might be. Yeah, it's not a vast amount of help having just someone playing for 60 yards without the ball. That's not really what you need.
Maybe defender. We've got Sam. Find us someone else with a question. Hands up. There we go. If you've got a question, just kind of try and get Sam's attention. So then by the time we've got the next question, we're ready to go.
Hi guys. I was just wondering. So there's a lot of talk about recruitment, and it'll be player recruitment. It seems to be working, but with coaches, we still have this massive managerial merry-go-round of ex-players just knocking around in the Championship, doing 10 games, and then they're off. Are we going to get a revolution in coaching of coaches who can interpret the data that they have better and be better coaches for it, and more understanding owners as well who will give them time to use the data?
Yeah, I think we've still got the same trend in terms of managers and probably having less chance to impact now than they did at the start of when the data revolution started. However, I think both owners and coaches particularly are better educated. It's on all of the coaching courses now, and everyone will have a module, if you like, on data and how it's used and being able to do it themselves. So I think what we have got, though, is externally to the football clubs, just huge scrutiny on the game and a lot of opinions and a lot of pressure around results. And I think that's the driving force. I think that hopefully most owners being slightly better educated and understanding what's going into a performance, you can actually assess whether the team are good or bad, whether they've been lucky, unlucky, whether they're performing in line with where their budget and their expectation is, or whether above it and below it and behaving appropriately. I think we've got more of them, but it's perhaps common sense, but not common practice. So it's still on its own way, on its own journey to doing it. But we're all emotional creatures, and I know, like with the owner of Stockport, is essentially a fan. So gets swayed, gets up, gets down, gets pissed off, gets massively happy, and I suppose it's my job inside the club to try and get him, more in line with what's actually going on.
I thought a few months ago that maybe there were fewer sackings, certainly at the top level, than you might have expected. That there would seem to be more managers who you thought, do you know what, 5 years ago they'd have gone by now. And I was starting to wonder whether football was maybe starting to change. And I don't know, I don't have the data on it. I think it might be the case that there might now be, that the average tenure of a manager might be starting to go up rather than go down. But then after that happened, literally all of them got sacked. So maybe it hasn't learned its lesson fully. But I would expect it to get more logical.
I was the same, yeah.
That you'll find that instead of a manager's getting, 150, 200 days or something, that might start to push towards 250, 300. They might get a full season. I think they should also introduce a transfer window for managers. That would make a lot of sense to me as well. But logically, the more data everyone has, the more they should be able to make those decisions. And the other thing which we talked about before, a lot of the owners are number-driven because big data runs pretty much every industry now. So however you made your money, whether you're a kind of vulture hedge fund or you run a chain of shops in your hometown and you've bought the club because you love it, you will understand that data is important. So I think that inclines ownership to listen to what the data says. And if the data says, look, this is a random sport and also there's a lot of variance and our underlying performances are quite good, then you'll probably listen to it. So that should change the way that managers are treated, I think, a little bit.
Anyone else?
This last question now, I'm afraid, because we're in a...
Last Sam, there's one at the back as well who's had his hand up every single time.
Okay, fine.
Two more.
2 questions.
Make it quick.
So observant work from you there, are we?
Hi, I'm Maurizio. Thank you for the very insightful discussion. I've got a very quick question. What's the most challenging position to scout and recruit for in a football team? So in terms of roles, position within the team.
I think when it comes down to your comes back down to your sort of overarching football idea, philosophy. Some of the systems that you play, it depends on how you construct your team. You can end up looking for niche type of roles. So, for example, in the system we play 3-5-2. The outside centre backs are a combination of a fullback that sits in, a midfielder that can handle the ball, and a centre half that can head it in League Two. And you tend to not find lots of them. So you look for like narrow traits because they've got to do sort of some of 3 different positions to be perfect in our model. Now another coach and another club might see it slightly different. Just want a straightforward, head it, kick it person that can, that we're good because we're going to defend deep and that's all we want to do. So you can, and I know that, for example, at Man City, as you might expect, the management there have got very, very specific ideas of what they want from players. So you could say in one instance that makes it easier because you're filtering out a lot of stuff. Once you know exactly what you want, you're getting rid of everything else. but then if you've not got a lot of those options in the market and that player isn't attainable for you right now, then you might have to tweak and look at either go with something else or go without and not change the position. So, it's. I think there's principles to recruit every single position, and thankfully, to recruit goalkeepers, because I don't know the first thing really about keep it out of the net, and that's about it. But which is important, right? But in terms of the detail that sits underneath it, you need specialism, and then the numbers have helped educate me a little bit in terms of what's important. But yeah, across all of the positions, there'll be some fundamentals that you're looking for.
I've never had to recruit a player, but I did have a friend who was a chief scout, then a technical director at a major Premier League club. But they had to stop him going to games because the manager would send him out and say, we're looking at the right back. And he'd come back and say, not sure about the right back, but I like the number 10. And then they'd send him the next week and he'd be like, look at the defensive midfielder, not sure about the defensive midfielder, but I like the number 10. And they worked out that all he wanted to sign was just a team full of number 10s, which I think as a scout is not ideal.
A good team to watch, eh?
Yeah.
Last one at the back then.
Thanks. Question for Simon first. At County, do you find that you've got all the information that you need sort of this season, for example, to sort of fulfil the club's objectives? Or do you think you're sort of you're banging your head against the wall thinking, God, if we had a championship budget, we would actually know X, Y, Z?
No, I think we've got what we need to in terms of, you mean data and information, is that what you mean?
Exactly.
Yeah. We probably can't get to some of the advanced analytics stuff that that clubs at the very top of the game will be able to get to, just because they'll be able to, one, turn it around quicker because they've got more manpower. Our goalkeeper coach just went to Newcastle 2 weeks ago, and he was talking about the speed that they're able to react to things that happens. Something might happen in a game, they're able to generate an insight quick enough to make it to half-time or the post-match meeting, which can be sometimes some complicated stuff that we wouldn't be able to get to, and if we were to do it, it might take us 6 months rather than that time, because we've got an army of people that can do it. We've got access to some pretty generic stuff, and we've got 2 or 3 people that work with us on a consultancy basis that can help us around specific things around recruitment or about playing style that we use periodically, and for me that's enough, because I suppose my thing is that, I said when we were talking before, I'd rather have 3 or 4 things that are absolutely fundamental and repeatedly used over the long term, rather than lots of complicated mathematicians waiting for the thing that may or may not happen. I can see how that's useful at the top of the game with an unlimited budget, but again, in our league, 46 games, you've got to be good in lots of those games. It's not just about winning the 1 or the 2. You've got to be able to have some fundamentals that you're able to repeat. And overall, that's kind of the way we go with it.
And after all of this, if your defender slips or your keeper drops the ball, it's completely random sometimes, isn't it? All of this data, and it can just be completely random.
Yeah.
So the crux of all of this is actually it doesn't really matter.
No.
That's what we see.
I go, it's good to know.
It's good to know.
Good to know it's random.
Gents, thank you so much for your time. Thank you very much to you guys as well for coming out this evening. But please, round of applause for Simon and for Rory.
Good enough?
Thank you very much.